Good afternoon. This is Carol Watson. I'm Senior Vice President for Programs at Easterseals, DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And I want to thank all of you for joining us for today's Candid conversation. It's a very important conversation that we're going to have around pandemic-related learning loss and mitigation strategies. Part of our discussion will focus on Maryland, but before we get to that, we're going to share a bit of information from a national perspective about what's happening in the space. I do want to acknowledge and thank our sponsor for today, Compass. They've done a lot of great work in helping to support us to get information out to families that need it, educators, et cetera. So thank you. I also want to thank everybody who's registered today. I know that everybody is very busy and a lot of people have been participating in webinars and all sorts of things over the past year. So thank you for making time to join us. Next, I want to thank our wonderful panel, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and then we'll go ahead and get started because we have a lot of great things to talk about, okay? So I'm going to ask Stephen to introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, Carol. My name is Stephen Hicks. I'm the Assistant State Superintendent for the Division of Early Childhood at the Maryland State Department of Education.
Okay, and Marcella?
Good afternoon. I'm Marcella Franczkowski, and I'm the Assistant State Superintendent for the Division of Early Intervention and Special Education at the Maryland State Department of Education. Thank you.
Thank you. Jevonna?
Hi, my name is Jevonna Willis. I am the Easterseals Head Start Director.
Thank you. Neville? And you might be on mute.
All right, Neville Adams, an educator at Prince George's County Public Schools.
Great, thank you, Neville. And we're going to end and begin our session with Paul.
My name is Paul von Hippel. I'm an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin. And I'm an expert on summer learning loss and missing data, both of which have been big issues during the pandemic.
Great, thank you. So Paul, why don't you go ahead and kick us off? And one thing I want to remind everyone of again, everyone on the panel, but also those who've made time to join us. This is a conversation. We call it Candid Conversations because what we've been through over the past year or so has been really challenging. A major pandemic that many people, most of us were not prepared for. And you have to have tough conversations around this, right? So I think we should embrace the tough conversations, embrace areas where we may not know information, and acknowledge that that's okay. We just have to have the courage to get the information that we need. So let's go ahead and start with Paul. Let's keep the emphasis on sharing the information, but let's have that conversation. Paul.
I just want to say that I can't see the chat from where I am. So if the moderator, I guess that's you, Carol, could just break in if you think there's a good reason to and hand it off to the person who wants to make a comment, that would be fine. Okay, thank you. So I'm honored to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. To go back a bit, schools first closed in March of 2020, a little more than a year ago. And it's hard to remember this, but initially the closures were only supposed to last a few weeks. And school responses were, schools were not thinking very far ahead, nor was anybody else. But it quickly became clear that the closures would last at least until the end of the academic year. And around then, people like me, people who do research on summer learning loss, school closures, and out of school time started getting asked what we thought would be the effect on children. And in a piece that I wrote for Education Next in April 2020, I said the crisis had effectively turned up the volume on families and turned it down on children. The crisis had made family resources more unequal even than they were before. And without schools to act as a buffer, I thought it was likely that inequalities among families would have a greater consequences for children's learning than it usually did. I've predicted the crisis was likely to be negative for almost all children's learning, but that the largest negative effects would be felt among children of the poor, children of less educated parents, children of single parents, children whose parents couldn't work from home, And I also thought the impact would be greater for younger children and might affect socio-emotional skills even more than it affected traditional academic skills like reading and math. And I also pointed out that unlike in past school closures due to long teacher strikes or natural disasters, massive resistance to desegregation, and so on, different examples from history, in this case, technology was likely to buffer the blow, at least for some students, which is fortunate, but not all parents would be equally able to take advantage of it. And within a few weeks, as I show on the next slide, there was evidence from Google searches that parents in affluent neighborhoods were indeed making a lot more use of online learning resources than parents in poor neighborhoods. And that was probably just one small part of the way that affluent parents were starting to compensate for the loss of schooling. You'll recall that many schools were completely closed, at least for part of spring of 2020. And so parents stepped in to compensate if they could. The socioeconomic gap in internet searches was there before the pandemic, but it grew much larger when the pandemic hit. So what was the impact of all this likely to be on students' development, or at least the aspects of development that we try to measure with test scores? We didn't know at first because spring tests were canceled, but there were some early projections based on the literature on summer learning loss. And the idea here was that summer vacation had effectively begun 3 months early. And
One quick thing,
Sure.
this is really good information you're sharing. I
Mhm.
wonder if you could share your slides in case people want to visually.
Oh
have
dear.
that experience
Yes,
visually.
I'm not sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you. It's
Here
really great
we
information.
Go.
Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, just to quickly show you what you missed, this graphic is probably not super important. Here's the evidence of Google searches taking off, the gap in Google searches for instructional materials growing between affluent and less affluent neighborhoods. It was a very disturbing finding, but also very clever to even think of looking for that. I was impressed with that piece of research. And then I would just gotten to this here, which is the early predictions of what the impact was likely to be. The predictions were based on this analogy to summer learning loss, and this was what we had to go on at the time. It's now a bit out of date, quite a bit out of date. And there were a number of problems with it. One was that summer learning was really an imperfect analogy. So, families are on vacation during summer, but it's clear from those Google search histories that a lot of affluent families weren't treating the experience as a vacation. It didn't feel like a vacation to much of anybody, but at least among affluent families, there was also a real attempt to make sure that kids kept on picking up academic skills that were not being provided by schools. And so it was a different experience than a summer vacation, where affluent families maybe send their kids off to camp or take them to an amusement park or something like that. That's not what was happening during this period. So I always thought that the analogy was imperfect. And in addition, I'd pointed out about a year earlier that the literature on summer learning loss is not as consistent as as you might think. So there are these kind of classic findings from the 1980s suggesting that that there's a lot of learning loss during the summer vacations, and that the gaps between high poverty schools and low poverty schools grow dramatically during summer vacations, so that a lot of the achievement gap that we see in 7th and 8th grade is really due to summer vacations. But those findings have been really difficult to replicate with modern tests. Here's an example. This is only 800 kids in Baltimore here. As it happens, it's a Maryland story. But then here is a much more recent study, the kindergarten class of 2010, 2011, using national data, and testers scored differently. There are different issues in how tests are administered and scored now. And we don't really see the same degree of learning loss on this modern test that we saw in tests in the 1980s. So there's some other things going on in terms of how we measure kids. It's not clear that summer learning loss is as substantial as was previously believed. That said, pandemic learning loss is very real. Schools did reopen in fall of 2020. You may recall that we were optimistic about schools opening in person in fall 2020. The pandemic lasted longer than folks expected in the spring. Schools did reopen in fall 2020, but 2/3 of them didn't open in person. They either opened remotely or in some kind of hybrid fashion. They did administer some tests, not the state required tests, the ones that were waived, the ones that are used for accountability, but voluntary formative assessments, for example, those given by the Northwest Evaluation Association, Renaissance Learning, and Curriculum Associates. And those three vendors published results describing what those fall test scores looked like. NWEA reported that fall math scores were 5 to 10 percentile points lower than they had been the previous fall among kids of the same age. So kids had fallen behind where, third graders, for example, this year's third graders were behind where last year's third graders were by 5 to 10 percentile points. But reading scores were pretty comparable, which was a big surprise and a relief. Renaissance Learning reported similar results. But results from Curriculum Associates were less sunny. Curriculum Associates results suggested there had been losses and in reading as well as math, and confirmed, all three vendors confirmed that the losses were greater for Black children, Hispanic children, and schools with high concentrations of children in poverty. So at this point, pardon me, I'm looking for my mouse. Here it is. Is it? So at this point, as of fall 2020, we were sure that there had been a lot of COVID learning loss, at least in math. The results for reading were less conclusive, and the information was really incomplete. 25 to 50% fewer kids than usual tested in fall 2020, and the kids who didn't test were probably experiencing greater learning loss than the kids who did. I mean, the fact that they weren't testing suggests they were less engaged in school, maybe had less access to technology, and were really exactly the kinds of kids that we should be most worried about. So although the situation looked bad, there was some concern that it was actually worse than it looked. And of course, it wasn't over. This is the Return to Learn tracker maintained by Nat Malkus at the American Enterprise Institute, has been tracking schools' mode of instructional delivery across the school year. And you can see that by the end of the school year, there were hardly any districts that were fully remote, but about half of all districts were hybrid and only half were fully in person. So many kids did not get anything close to their usual school experience and were sort of doing the best that they could online, which was a highly variable experience depending on the family's resources and how the school system handled things. So we know that the fall test scores didn't look great. The spring test scores have not been released in most states yet, but the same vendors, Curriculum Associates, NWEA, Renaissance Learning, did administer spring tests. Response rates were again low, but they're going to summarize those results, at least NWEA is, in a report to be released in July. In addition, the federal government reinstated requirements that districts test in all states, either this spring or in the fall. I understand from a pre-presentation conversation that Maryland has delayed testing until fall. Texas is one of the states that tested in spring, and it's going to release its results shortly. The commissioner has warned everybody that they're even worse than expected. So there's really been quite a lot less learning during the pandemic than there would have been in a normal, uninterrupted school year. And there's been a lot of argument about how closed schools needed to be, whether some of the policies were less than optimal. It was all such a rush job that it's actually difficult to criticize, and it's all water under the bridge at this point. The real question that we need to answer now is what we're going to do to make up for lost time. What are we going to do to compensate these children for what's happened to their learning during the pandemic? Many of the solutions that are being discussed involve adding instruction time. There's a lot of talk about summer school, summer learning programs, extended school year, after school programs. There's a substantial amount of federal money available for high intensity tutoring, and all of these interventions can be effective. I'm a little concerned about how long this all can be sustained, how well it's going to be implemented, how engaged students will be. Will they see it as some kind of punishment? How engaged will teachers be? Both teachers and families are already suffering from burnout. And I'm concerned about where we're going to be when the sense of urgency passes, which might be as early as Christmas or so. And so my colleague Veronica Yan and I I've been talking to different districts and ed tech vendors about learning science, because there is in fact a portfolio of lab tested techniques that have been tested in small field trials in the classroom that can help students learn and retain more in the same time. These techniques, which really haven't been rolled out to the extent that they should be, have never been more needed. And so we've been recruiting districts and ed tech vendors to implement learning science interventions in fall. And if folks on this call are interested in learning more about that, we'd be happy to talk to you about it as well. As soon as I can find my mouse, get my mouse on the right screen, I will stop sharing. I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble unsharing my screen. I wonder if somebody else could do it for me.
There's a little button at the top, Paul. That's
Yes, I see the button, but I can't seem to get
Push
my
that.
mouse to it
Okay.
because of the way things are split.
So while you're working on that, and maybe one of our, there we go, genius. So thank you so much for sharing that information, Paul. I just want to sort of share one comment and get some reactions to it. Neville, especially maybe from you, but also others. I've had conversations with people, different people, educators, data scientists, parents, et cetera. And there are differences of opinion when it comes to learning loss, and people have different reactions. Some people think when they hear data like the data that you just described, that it's saying that teachers, educators didn't do a good job during the pandemic. They were working really hard to keep things going. Parents were working hard to do what they could do. So how do we put this in a perspective to say, you know what, we saw you, we value you, and we appreciate you. This is what we're saying. Can somebody just react to that? And maybe Paul, you, Stephen, just give some
Carol, I want to say something about that, because I was thinking about that as well when around this topic. Teachers were very compromised in the way in which they could do instruction. We have a pre-K program for 4-year-olds in Maryland, very robust, mixed delivery. Childcare programs continued on because childcare is dependent upon students being there. These are small businesses, unlike public education that continues to get financed, right? So our pre-K in the public school, I popped in on a couple of lessons because I wanted to see how those were being conducted. So I saw a math lesson and a literacy lesson. And I'm a former early childhood teacher. I taught pre-kindergarten through 3rd grade. But looking at that teacher trying to keep 20 kids on a Zoom call engaged around a very specific math concept, first of all, it took the entire 30 minutes to try to engage all of those children. And I could see her just working so hard to keep them focused and on task. I mean, typically in a classroom, and those of us that have been early childhood teachers, it's very challenging, right? Because kids at that age are distracted and you need to keep them motivated and interested and on task. But when they're in their own environments and kids were lying on the floor, some of these were at a kitchen table, some had a parent with them, but some did not. It is quite challenging. So I don't think it's about the teacher not being an effective teacher given normal circumstances. I think it's the enormous challenge of trying to deliver young children virtually.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Neville, do you want to comment on that very quickly before we turn it back over to Stephen?
Yes. I definitely wholeheartedly agree with that in terms of that aspect of you teaching and what you're having to deal with, as well as the relationship that, of course, the collective in terms of teachers have with their students, and that bond was broken on both sides. And when you're approaching it, we have to deal with more of the trauma aspect, which both teachers and students had to deal with, because they lost that safety that they normally have and that direction that they normally have. and that was, snatched away from them.
Exactly.
And they were expected to continue on. They were expected to be tested, and they're testing them as if they would have learned the same type of information. And it's nice that what you all are saying, if our administrators or people who are, leading the charge for us are not coming to us as if we are being evaluated the same way. We might not have they're saying, okay, this year, our evaluations are going to be across the board, but that's across the board in terms of them saying everyone will have an evaluation that it will not be a negative evaluation. But that doesn't apply to the comments that go into your evaluation.
Exactly.
So you can have an evaluation that says, okay, we were in the pandemic, but then all of the other comments that go into, oh, you weren't at a Zoom meeting on time.
Yeah.
Those are the things that aren't being factored in.
Got it. Thank you so much for that, Neville. I think you're bringing an interesting perspective as a teacher and educator. So thank you for that. I do want to point out there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. We're going to follow up on those questions near the end. And also we'll be sending links to resources, towards the end of the session as well. I'm going to turn it over to Stephen. Stephen has quite a bit of good information to share about what's happening within the state. Then we'll go to Marcella.
Sure, thanks, Carol. And I did have some slides, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to share some big points. And I want to build on what Neville said, because teachers are more than just delivering instruction. They are providing for the social emotional foundation for young students. And my area is early childhood, but this goes all the way through the upper grades. And our children have experienced, as we all have, a very traumatic event, the most traumatic event probably in our lifetimes. And it's not over, by the way, either. And teachers are continuing to have to grapple with the fact that they're going to be opening in fall, almost as if there was no pandemic, trying to do business as usual. And yet we're really still not out of the woods. And parents are concerned, children are concerned, and of course our teachers are concerned. I also want to thank Paul for talking about this idea of what summer loss is and the comparison of or the analogy of the summer learning loss, because we talk a lot about that, especially in early childhood, where we invest so much in preparing children for success when they enter kindergarten through early childhood programs like Head Start, like pre-K, and then we look at the results of what happens in kindergarten and we think, well, they didn't really get that attention during the summer, and it's all along with all the grades too, but it's really about this interruption in learning that they've had that began at the end of 2020, and continued, which was the tail end of 1 year, and then all this last year. So it's huge. It can't be underestimated, as Paul was really saying. In Maryland, we are forming these implementation teams to work with our local school systems. We have 24 local school systems. So in all of this, I think it's important to remember there's no blame to go around. If you want to blame anybody, you blame the coronavirus, right? It is not the parents' fault. It is not the students' fault. It is not the teachers' fault. It is not the districts or the schools or the state's fault or the nation's fault. It is what we are having to all address and deal with. And so it doesn't do any good to start placing blame on any one group or individual of not, doing what they need to do. So these implementation teams will be working with our local school systems and counties, really the whole counties, from a perspective of learning that begins at birth. Because in Maryland, we have at the Maryland State Department of Education responsibility for learning and development from birth to grade 12. So we're thinking of the whole continuum. So these implementation teams will be working not only with thinking about what kind of strategies are needed in the fall to make up for any of this interruption in education, but also thinking about the social emotional development. This is really, really critical. And I know I talked to a lot of my colleagues in DC, my colleagues in Virginia, and this is definitely something they prioritize as well. The social emotional aspect of all of this is as important as the academic aspect. Now, my area is early childhood, and in early childhood, we had at the beginning of the pandemic, only 29% of our childcare programs reopening once they were closed for a day, and then were invited to reopen if they follow the safety and health standards. But that's not very much childcare, you know, and that means that a lot of kids did not get the learning and development that they need to be successful later in school. And we are now at about 91%, but that's taken over a year to get back to a better capacity. And even the programs that are operating are not operating with full classrooms because there's a shortage in the workforce. People have left the profession. People are wary to go back to the profession. People have found other professions that are more amenable than being on site during a pandemic in a childcare program. So that has meant that a lot of the children, you know, we're not even thinking of the kids, just the kids that might be pre-kindergarten to 12th grade that have missed and had an interruption in their learning, but kids that didn't get the foundation in early childhood before even entering school. So we have to think of those kids too. So we're working, we're fortunate enough to have some great funding resources through the American Rescue Plan Act. Thanks to Congress. So Maryland received $500 million to implement over the next couple years. And some of those funds will be used to help parents better afford childcare so they can provide that foundation of learning and development so essential for success later on. Some of those funds will be used to sustain our existing childcare programs. Some of the funds will be used to improve the quality of programs and provide additional support for those programs. We had the unfortunate circumstance of a combination of additional funds for pre-K at a time when schools and enrollment were very much depleted. So last year, we had 27% fewer children in pre-K in our public pre-K program. A third of our pre-K students were not in school, not getting the preparation that they need to be successful later in kindergarten. And I think what Paul mentioned before about this equity issue is really critical, and we cannot lose sight of that. If you look at our data for that 27%, and also, by the way, 10% of kids were not in kindergarten. That's a huge loss. That's about 6,000 kids out of 60,000 kids in public kindergarten in Maryland, which is full day and required. So those kids were somewhere. And most of the kids that were in school doing virtual learning, which I just explained was not really optimal as hard as teachers worked to make it optimal, those kids that were in school were mostly our kids of color and low-income kids. The 27% that were not in school, not getting the virtual instruction, were either at private schools, were either homeschooled, or were in these kind of clusters where more middle-class families can afford to maybe hire an individual teacher, a tutor, to work with 5 or 6 students. Well, those kids are probably going to be better prepared. And we see the gap among our kids of color, our lower income families, and more middle class white kids, widening. So that is compounding a problem that already existed. So we're hopeful that these additional funds that we get, and also the additional funding that we can use for the summer enrichment, although as Paul mentioned, teachers are exhausted, kids are exhausted. And the funding that we're using is not only for summer, but also for that transition, because that's such a pivotal time as children enter kindergarten from early childhood programs to give them the continual support through that kindergarten year. But it's also going to be important for first grade, second grade, third grade, and on.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. I think you brought up a lot in there, and I hope people were taking notes because you shared some really good information. I want to come back to a few points and ask Jevonna and Neville, who are practitioners on the ground, to ask them to react to some of those things, the racial and ethnic disparities and how they may be manifesting, and also what they're doing to mitigate and counter loss as a practitioner. Before I do that, I do want to pass it to Marcella. Everyone knows Easterseals, we've been around for a little over 100 years, and we are very committed to all children, including children with varying abilities. And so I want to ask Marcella her thoughts, her thinking, and get some insight from her around what's happening from a state perspective as it relates to children of varying abilities.
Thank you, Carol. And you are a longtime partner. Easterseals has been a partner in this work, a collaborative partner, and one that has really guided our work for students with developmental needs, our youngest children, as well as our students with disabilities. So thank you for that. I thought I would begin today just framing a little bit of our population. Next slide, please. So that you know who we serve in Maryland for students with the need of early intervention by a developmental disability or by a disability. Maryland serves, as Stephen has said, birth to 12, but in special education, grade 12, in special education, we are birth through age 21. So we are beyond the 12th grade age, but we serve, and we're a birth mandate state. So we start very young, believing earlier the better for intervention, and going through the age of 21. We have 3 buckets, just to let you know. Our infants and toddlers program is our traditional birth to 3, birth to 4 program in Maryland because we're an extended option. We serve about 8% of the population of that age group, of that juvenile population group in our Maryland infants and toddlers program. That's quite remarkable. And we have a large safety net to ensure earlier the better and that we get to our families and children. Our preschool was about 8%. Of that age group, ages 3 to 5, we serve through an IEP, an individualized education program, and then our large population, age 3 to 21, is about 12% of our population. Our population is changing in the infants and toddlers world. We're seeing a 56% increase in our Spanish-speaking families. We are seeing a 58% in our newborns that have been drug exposed. So we are a shifting population, a changing population, and one that needs to be responsive. So I thought this might help our birth to 21. Unique in early intervention special education is students with disabilities have very serious, focused rights, and ones that are a safety net for them and their families. So unique to this extended school closure is that there were absolutely no waivers for students with disabilities that were on an IFSP, which is a baby IEP, our youngest learners, or our IEP, ages 3 to 21. There were no waivers. Only Congress can grant that, and they said there are no waivers. So the 6 components of IDA that you know, to implement FAPE is implementing that individualized program to the greatest extent possible, all services, all accommodations, all attention to the goals and objectives on that individualized plan. There was no flexibility. It was an expectation. That was covered through the IEP. All of our appropriate and timely evaluations. There were no extensions to assessments or evaluations. Our students continued to be educated in the least restrictive environment for them, whether that be a segregated environment, an inclusive setting, or whatever it may be. Parent and teacher participation in the individualized implementation is a requirement. And then, of course, all procedural safeguards. Bottom line here is there were no waivers in the implementation of specially designed instruction for students with disabilities, birth through the age of 21. So how do we operationalize that in Maryland? That's a pretty big task, right? How do we then look at this work, knowing I'm not going to go through the timeline, you have all referenced the March timeline, but March 15th, the gray box, school programs, buildings, brick and mortar were closed. That forced the entire state to go into a virtual distance learning model. Did not mean, so the change in the IEP or the educational plan for a student with disabilities, same implementation of goals and objectives. The only thing that changed was how we were delivering it. This was a significant learning curve to the state of Maryland, to our teachers, to our special education teachers, to our general education teachers. That shifted. Maryland was not totally embraced in a technology broad spectrum for use of technology, accessibility. Our teachers were not in that training to do all instruction through virtual distance. It shifted Maryland's educational system, infrastructure, and expectations to a whole different level. With MSDE, you'll see green is general education, all students. Blue is only for students with disabilities. So we moved in with spring that our state school superintendent said that each local school system had to create a learning continuity plan for every student, including students with disabilities. On top of that learning plan that was required by MSDE, every IEP or IFSP, right, for a student with a developmental delay or a disability, they had to review, amend, or revise and implement the IEP for each student because there was no waivers. So our special education teachers, there is a beyond kudo to the attention, the shift in their life, whether it be a personal shift with their own family or in the delivery, the service delivery. All of our teachers, including teachers of students with special needs, have done a yeoman's task to accommodate. And I want to thank Neville for personally for his attention to this work. So then we entered last summer. We continued our summer programs for students with disabilities, and then the new school year began. Unexpected, as we heard today. This was a shock. We never thought the nation or our school system, which is the economy, which is linked to economy and service overall, work, childcare, et cetera, it was going to have quite an impact. In last school year, beginning March 1, our governor and our state school superintendent said all schools will open for face-to-face instruction. Family choice was given, and we went into a varied service model. You could do virtual, totally virtual family. They could do hybrid, which I want to add to Stephen's comment. While he saw a totally virtual, an even greater challenge, and Neville may be able to say this, is when you have children on the screen and 4 or 5 children behind you. So that concurrent instruction even added to a more complex service delivery model for our teachers. So at that time last year, until March 1, there was virtual, hybrid, face-to-face, and throughout the year, we had those opportunities. But our governor and our superintendent felt very strongly that brick and mortar school buildings as of March 1, almost all of our schools opened with some level of face-to-face. Students with disabilities, young children, and students with disabilities were given a priority as we brought small groups back and as we rolled out plans. So we did move into a recovery state. Every local school system, again, now was to submit and have conversation with MSD to have a recovery plan for all students. With that, in addition to that recovery plan, our students with disabilities were required to relook at the IEPs, look at new, additional, different needs. Social emotional needs have increased. Look at the needs of each individual student on an IEP and relook at how we're going to move forward with instruction. And I'm going to talk a little more about that. Going into normal operations, and that is quite a, we could use quotation marks as we move into next school year. MSD is stating that face-to-face is the rule and virtual is the exception. So we feel very strongly that face-to-face instruction is explicit instruction, hands-on, having our teachers, having the consistency of programming, having the consistency of peers, that is a focus of MSDE. So as we move forward, we are looking for a full opening face-to-face options for all children in the state of Maryland. So what were the top 3 challenges for students with disabilities? Please know that I'm coming with a lens while I speak for all. There were some pretty significant, and they continue to be pretty significant pieces. Besides these top 3 challenges, we know about engagement, right? We know about technology. So all those that have been referenced by everyone else, they remain consistent also for all children. But in our world of early intervention and special education, our Maryland Infants and Toddlers Program referrals, as Stephen referenced on kindergarten, on preschool, we saw the same change and the same issues with children not and families not being a part of this. When we started in April of 2019, so that's just a month, as we moved, there was a 70% to April 2020, a 70% decrease in the number of children and families that accessed our also needed early intervention infants and toddlers program model. I can say that MSD moved into quick motion. Public announcements went on television, public awareness campaign occurred, and within 1 year, we have a 205% increase of new families in Maryland Infants and Toddlers program. So this is kudos to MSDE and kudos to our local infants and toddlers programs. So referrals went down, we are recovering. The other piece in special education that was a big concern to us, and this is no surprise to you, were the students who needed the most extensive, intensive, individualized support. Students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, the students who need hand-over-hand instruction. That was a population within that really brought a challenge to engagement, to technology, and to delivering specially designed instruction. Where we are in recovery is becoming and is a challenge. So under the law, again, under IDEA, a student with a disability, if they were denied or we did not provide FAPE, which is the implementation of the individualized program, then there can be, and there is a regression, then in the law, as we move forward, we are looking at providing compensatory education or recovery services. So the child with a regression, so one of our responses, but clearly in the law, one of our responses to the learning loss is to mitigate, to provide a remedy through providing compensatory education and recovery services for those students who are eligible. This is a challenge for us because it does impact a large number of students, and it is one that our schools are positioned to look at individualizing compensatory education to each student as eligible under an IEP or an IFSP. So these are the critical pieces that we're addressing pre-pandemic and in recovery. So to summarize, I'm not going to go through this, just to look at those factors. I want to say that probably, and this aligns with the research and the conversation that we had today, where were we compromised in that teaching learning environment? The reduced structure and framework, right? Especially for students with disabilities. What do they do best in? Structure. Consistent peers, a consistent schedule, their teacher is a lifeline to many of our students with disabilities. When that teacher changes, when she looks different, when she's acting different, when when they are providing teaching and learning, that reduced structure and framework took a toll. The limited social interaction, right? Those peers are models. Many times in inclusive settings, it's that peer, that typically developing peer that is shaping the behavior of a student who may have issues and concerns in the behavior management area. So the interaction and the collaboration with peers, the lack of motivation, the lack of peer support, and sometimes student to peer and peer to peer, student to teacher, that positive or that lack of encouragement. So we did see that, and therefore what did we see? As we heard with research and Stephen, an increase in social, emotional, and behavioral health needs. We saw regression of learning, again, validated in research, but we limited explicit instruction, right? The fidelity of our implementation of specially designed instruction. Progress monitoring. We don't know how to act, we don't know how to teach without progress monitoring. It is very difficult to monitor progress totally 100% virtually. So that monitoring of progress, which informs all instruction, is a challenge as we continue to move forward. I already talked to you about technology. I will say that that's going to be a positive on the right-hand side. Maryland has grown exponentially by teacher use of technology, by creating greater broad spectrum broadbands, so that now in the West and the East, on the shore and the mountains, we have better broad spectrum spans. So please know that that is a positive takeaway. And as it has all been said, the #1 predictor of success for children in school is what? The relationship between school and families. This has become the increased reliance on our parents and families, which has taken a toll, has shown some disparity and some inequity, no question about that. But at the same time, I really believe a positive to that on the other side is that our families recognize the power that they have over the instruction and how they can exponentially be coached to support their child's progress and success. If that parent spends a little extra time on that lesson or that work with that child that now they've been coached to see as the teacher was providing instruction, that has an exponential impact on a child's progress. So the positives are we have expanded that network of supports with families. I'm very excited to say that in Maryland, we are going to continue virtual IFSP and IEP meetings. Think about the power. Our families do not have to take off a half a day to travel, to sit in a team meeting and to participate. They can involve the child care person. They can involve grandmom and grandpa. They can involve the rabbi, the minister, the priest, people that have really worked with that child so that we can look at the whole child. They can now participate through a virtual meeting that could be a half an hour, 45 to an hour versus 2-3 hours. So very excited about that. I did share about the increased learner and the family capacity in this work, and we are looking at reduced inequity looking at this work. So some strategies. What do we see as global strategies in focusing on this? And I've kept these strategies very big picture, but I have to tell you, for this work to have been done, it's about innovation. It's not doing the same thing. It's not the way we always have done business. Our life, our world, our education has changed. The innovation that we have seen in classrooms, the front porch lessons, the playground lessons, they have been innovations to make a difference. The coaching of our families for collaboration, that has been the key. How do you collaborate, make a family engaged in the conversation, feeling that they're making decisions on this work? And how do we collaborate across disciplines, across general ed and special ed, and families being engaged, meaningful, informed partners? It's all about individualization. As we come back, looking at the progress for each child with an IEP, communicating with families, looking at new, different, additional needs, and then revising that child's individualized program to begin. I learned yesterday that Baltimore City is requiring an individualized program plan for each child with and without a disability in order to move forward. So that individualization is where we are, because for some children, this has been teaching and learning from home has been a positive. You know, a child with school phobia, school anxiety, this has been a positive. So please know, learning and looking at each individual child is our work. And then, as Stephen has said, we have also received, specific to students with disabilities, relief funding that we will funnel and support. What are our methods to look at that learning loss? Number one, under our new Kerwin House Bill, I believe it's 1372, summer program and tutoring to be offered is required for all students across the state of Maryland. This has come out through legislation. So all students with or without a disability, summer programming is available in every local school system across Maryland. And then after summer, looking at individual profiles of students, there will be tutoring and intervention programs put in place. On top of that first bullet is students with disabilities. As part of their program, if they need extended school year, it is already a part of their IEP, and as appropriate, they will get extended school year services for their IEP. In addition to that, it's the compensatory education that I talked to you about. All of our families, our students, every student with an IEP must be looked at to look individually, their progress, if they were given their full IEP, their FAPE, and if there was a regression, then they will receive compensatory education services. All of this is to support a remedy to mitigate, thank you, the loss.
And sorry, Marcella, one quick question. Someone is asking in the chat, what is SWD?
I apologize, and
No
I was just trying to save real estate. It's students with disabilities. I apologize.
Great, thank you. And Marcella, I see you have a few resources that you're going to go over very quickly, and I just want to let people know we will send you links to these resources as well.
And Carol, that's great. On the bottom, there is a link. And please know that we've created technical assistance bulletins. We've created tips for teachers. There's one that we just talked about, tips to support concurrent virtual and face-to-face instruction. So there's tips for teachers, there's tips for families, as well as parents' guide to take us through our pandemic response as well as recovery. And that is it. So thank you. Carol, I would just like to leave with one question for all of us. Can I have my very last slide, please?
Yep.
With sugar on top. I think the question as we move forward is how do we reimagine all education? Because it's not going to be the same. You know, teachers are not coming back the same, families are not coming back the same, students are not coming back the same. So how do we reimagine this for all students and especially students with disabilities? And I appreciate Easterseals continuing to support our children and families, and I appreciate teachers and our work out there in the field. Thank you for all you do each and every day. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Marcella. That was so much great information. And to be honest with you, I'm going to need to go through it again and listen to this myself because I need to take a lot more notes and I have a lot of things to follow up on. I want to pause for a moment, get some quick comments, reactions from Jevonna Willis, who runs Head Start in Prince George's County, and also Neville Adams, who's a teacher in the county. I want to hear your reactions to what you've heard, but also any ideas that you have very quickly. And then the audience, our colleagues who made time to join us, actually had like 3 very quick questions from the chat box that I want to go over. So Jevonna, first you, then Neville very quickly. Any reactions you want to share?
Sure, thank you, Carol. I just wanted to thank Marcella. Lots of the data and information that she shared is music to our ears. It's lots of what we've been doing and what we've been, you know, for all of our staff, that's the boots on the ground. We have 10% of our population in the Easterseals Head Start program that is IEP or IFSP. And throughout this amazing year, very different year, as Stephen would say, we had an opportunity really to focus on 2 things. One of the things we focused on is how we were going to individualize for families and how we were going to use our resources to make sure our families had what they need. We provided very specific services for our families. We have children in our program from 6 weeks all the way up to the age of 5. So we provided technology. Marcella spoke a little bit about technology. We provided technology to our families that have that were second language learners and allowed them to use closed caption so that when our teachers were presenting our lessons, they were able to engage and they could use, we didn't have to specifically have translators. So we did every possible thing we could to make some of those very specific points that she spoke about really come alive in our program. Our parents were excited. Throughout the course of the year, we were able to stay fully enrolled, which meant that we didn't lose a lot of our families. They stayed with us. Our teachers spent time teaching our families in the evening. We had individual sessions, we had group sessions. We also decided to utilize the resources that were around us. We worked with our public schools and make sure that we were had very specific conversations with parents about keeping our children kindergarten ready. We're going to have a summer program where half of our children that are going to be going to kindergarten in the fall, they're going to be participating face-to-face in that summer program that's hands-on, STEM with some of our very eager teachers that are excited to welcome them back into the classroom 5 days a week. We also have an opportunity where we work with the public library to make sure that our children had additional books. We work with our community partners and provided field trips and anything we could possibly think of to meet our families individually, we did that. So thank you for your help, for your guidance, and all of what you guys are sharing. It has made a big difference, and we're hoping through some of the programs we are also in the process of planning an upcoming after-school program for the first time, because we know we need to think, in advance about how this upcoming school year will have an impact on our program.
Thank you so much, Jevonna. Neville, any reactions from you before I share these very important questions from the Q&A box?
Yes, quickly, I definitely appreciate everyone and everything that they're doing. And I just want to make sure that as we are moving forward, that we, any policy that is to be made and things that are coming, that they include all stakeholders so that we don't run into this situation of biased information and we perpetuate the same inequities that we have been dealing with. Because, I know like a lot of statistics and how it comes across a lot as if differences in the socioeconomic background that students who may have maybe access to more money or parents that could stay at home, that they were not apathetic. They were apathetic. Like, my children, my actual children, they are in a school system that has this a really more affluent situation. And a lot of the things that were done in terms of reporting the losses within their school system was a little different from the reporting that was here. Like, it was more reporting from this school system, which is if it's something that we know, if you've been in education for a while, that you do get more, we are conditioned to report a lot more of the failures of people of color as opposed to non-people of color. And so I want to make sure that we make sure that we pay attention to other stakeholders and have them come to the table to help in the decision-making process.
Very good point. Very good point. Thank you. Let's take a couple of questions from the chat box. Paul, this one is for you. Let's see. I have it right here. What are some of the techniques? I'm just going to read, we have 3 major questions. So I'll read them all so that the panel can think about them. The first one is definitely for you, Paul. What are some of the techniques from the Learning Science lab that you mentioned? And then the other 2 questions, does anyone quantify in any way the non-academic lessons and skills learned during these challenging times? That can be of great value and long-lasting value. So think about that. Again, does anyone quantify in any way the non-academic lessons and skills learned during the pandemic? And the last question, how do you evaluate a 7-year-old boy to decide if he should repeat a grade? There's a family located in Nevada, Ohio. They did some online learning. Now the family has decided to change schools. School number 3, major move. Bottom line is, how do you evaluate a 7-year-old boy to decide if he should repeat a grade? So we'll take them in order. Paul, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'm off mute. Good.
Yes.
So there are a number of learning science techniques that have been demonstrated in laboratory, some of which have been tried in small field trials involving a couple of dozen teachers at the most. The one that Veronica and I are focused on right now is what's called interleaving. So in topics like mathematics, there's a tendency to teach this week's topic, give homework that's focused on this week's topic, and then never come back to it until the end of the semester. And it's a very slippery mode of instruction. Students tend to kind of figure out a rote way of answering the questions, and they kind of get the hang of it and feel like it's going all right. And then when it comes back on an end of year exam or something like that, they not only have they maybe lost some of the skills, but they don't recognize the situation in which it's required. They can't tell that situation from other situations. So interleaving involves mixing up the questions that you ask students and the skills that are required. And the laboratory and field trials suggest that students, they don't do as well on their weekly assignments because they're having to figure it out more. But when their knowledge is assessed at the end of the year, they typically do better because they've been practicing distinguishing between different kinds of problem types the whole year, which is something that's missing in a lot of math instruction.
Good. So maybe what we can do, Paul, is you can send us or share with us some links. And when we do our follow-up email to the registrants, we can share information with them. Okay?
I just wanted to comment on the other two questions. I
Yes,
know we're
please.
time sensitive. So
Thank you.
in Maryland, we do have the kindergarten readiness assessment. We also have an early learning assessment. The early learning assessment is for children from 36 months to 72 months. And it is across all domains, including social emotional. The kindergarten readiness assessment is given to children in public kindergarten during the first few weeks of kindergarten. And it is in 4 domains: early literacy, math, physical health and well-being, and social emotional learning. And so we will be very interested in looking at those kindergarten readiness assessment results to see how we can support school systems and individual schools and classrooms in providing the necessary supports for that. In regards to a child that is, they're thinking of retaining them, I think most of the literature I have read says that retention is not effective. I think that all teachers are going to be faced with children across a range of readiness for whatever grade they're going into. And we in Maryland, we have pre-K and we have mandatory kindergarten. And we have a lot of parents that have come to us and said, well, I'm not sure if my child should go to kindergarten. They're at the right age, but their pre-K experience wasn't that great, we think. And so I'm just not sure. You know what? Every kindergarten teacher faces a range of levels in their classroom. And it is that, and I'm a former kindergarten teacher and I love kindergarten. And I would make sure I monitored the level of achievement and readiness or skill level for every child. And I work individually with each child on bringing them to the point at the end of the year where they're ready for that next grade. And that's what every teacher does. So I would definitely not recommend retaining students unless there is a really severe reason to do that, which is extremely rare.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Stephen. And we are a little beyond our time. I want to thank all of the panelists for joining us, for sharing your knowledge with us and resources. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we'll send out a follow-up email to all registrants. That email will contain links to some of the information that you heard about during this call. So thank you all so much. I do want to also thank Comcast again for sponsoring this session. Thank you and be well.